The man's house was far too small to contain all the money he had earned. The wardrobe was already stuffed with 80 pounds of gold, and the storage room was packed with suitcases full of cash. So, he had no choice but to bury all the money in the yard, hiding it in the stable. His wife was just looking for a pair of shoes, but when she opened the shoebox, she found stacks of cash. Carrying 2 bags of cash, the man walked into the warehouse, and when he opened the door, the money almost buried him. He tried to bury the money in the yard, but after digging for a while, he found the cash he had buried the last time. Realizing there was no more space at home, the man decided to deposit the money in the bank. He deposited at least $10 million in each bank. A small town of just 2,000 people ended up with dozens of banks, all thanks to him. To make things easier for him, the banks even set up a vault specifically for his use. At the same time, the man started numerous shell companies for money laundering, appointing janitors as CEOs, but despite his arrogance, no one dared to arrest him. Even the CIA, FBI, and the White House sought his help. This entire story was based on real events, and the man in question was Barry Seal. His life was truly a real-life legend. Barry was once the youngest pilot in the history of Trans-World Airlines. His flight record was almost flawless, with no mistakes whatsoever. On top of that, he had a beautiful wife and adorable children. Thanks to the airline's generous benefits, along with a side income from smuggling cigars, Barry led a comfortable and wealthy life. That was until a man named Schaefer came along, turning his life upside down. When they first met, Schaefer immediately knew Barry's name and personal details. He even knew all about the cigar smuggling, which made Barry a little nervous. But Schaefer quickly revealed his identity, claiming to be from the CIA. They were planning to establish a country in Central America, and Barry's exceptional flying skills were exactly what they needed. To demonstrate his sincerity, Schaefer even offered Barry an aircraft. Sure enough, the new twin-engine aircraft left Barry in awe. However, the strange camera on the underside of the plane caught his attention, and Schaefer explained that it was for intelligence gathering. At the time, the US and USSR were in the midst of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was secretly supporting communist rebels in the Americas. Barry's mission was to film these armed forces to prove their threat. However, such a mission was clearly illegal. If caught, the CIA would deny his identity and offer no assistance. Clearly, this wasn't a good job. It was dangerous, and the pay was low. But whether it was the thrill or an innate sense of adventure, Barry eventually agreed. From then on, he frequently flew across the skies of the Americas. Each time he discovered armed forces, he would lower his altitude for a close-up shot. With his extensive flying experience, he flew at an extremely low altitude, and the CIA was pleased with the photos he took. However, at the same time, his chances of being attacked increased significantly. Once, he was even hit in the engine, narrowly avoiding a crash. Fortunately, he reacted quickly and managed to stabilize the aircraft, barely escaping with his life. He believed no one could do the job better than him, and with his wife just having given birth to their child, Barry asked Schaefer for a raise. But Schaefer merely brushed him off with a few vague words and handed him a new assignment. That was to deliver money to a Panamanian colonel in exchange for intelligence. The task itself wasn't complicated or dangerous, but due to a change in the flight route, he needed to stop in Colombia for refueling before heading back. Little did he know, this seemingly insignificant change would completely alter Barry's fate. One day, Barry was fueling up as usual, but a jeep suddenly appeared and brought Barry to a man. Barry had no idea who the man was, but the man knew everything about him. He even knew that Barry took photos every week and sent them to the CIA. Jorge immediately stated his purpose, asking Barry to transport some goods to the US on his return trip. Seeing that Barry still didn't fully understand, Jorge took him directly to the plantation. That's when Barry realized they were smuggling contraband. At that time, the US had strict checks on contraband, so Jorge had to find another way to approach Barry. If Barry agreed, they'd pay him $2,000 per kilogram. $2,000 in 1980 was a substantial amount, and Barry was clearly tempted. But seeing the plane wreckage and the short runway, he knew the job wouldn't be as easy as it seemed. But for the sake of his wife and kids, he decided to take the risk. However, to avoid trouble, he couldn't make the delivery himself. Barry came up with a clever plan. He marked a location on the map. He had Jorge's people wait there in advance while he took off with 300 kilograms of cargo. Once he reached the designated spot, he set the plane on autopilot and dropped the packages. He then cleaned the cabin with disinfectant to prevent any detection by sniffer dogs. In just one trip, Barry made $600,000, which was more than his annual salary at the CIA. Jorge and his men earned even more, and they could do this every week. As they were planning the next shipment, a group of police suddenly surrounded their villa. As a result, Barry and Jorge were arrested and taken to jail. However, they were prominent figures in the area, and the next day, they were released from the police station. But no one really cared about what happened to Barry. Fortunately, Schaefer showed up just in time, but the news he brought made Barry's heart sink. It turned out the CIA already knew about Barry's smuggling and was ready to abandon him. The police were also preparing to search Barry's house. Upon hearing this, Barry fell into despair, but Schaefer gave him a glimmer of hope. this matter could actually be solved easily, but Barry would need to agree to one conditions. It turned out the communist rebels Barry had photographed earlier had completely taken over Nicaragua, but President Reagan couldn't tolerate having a communist country right on his doorstep. He wanted to support the local rebels to drive them out of Nicaragua, but Congress feared that the president's move would drag the US into a war, so they vetoed the proposal. The president immediately contacted the CIA, and the CIA then reached out to Barry. They asked Barry to transport weapons to the rebels, and if he refused, he would spend the rest of his life in a Colombian prison. Barry had no choice but to comply. However, Schaefer's authority couldn't revoke the police search warrant for his house, but the CIA had already prepared a new residence for them. So Barry hurried home and woke up his sleeping wife. After quickly packing a few essentials, he took his family and left in the middle of the night. The new house was in a picturesque small town, clean and tidy, but it still needed some furniture. But his wife stared at the empty house, lost in thought, overwhelmed by how suddenly everything had happened. At that moment, Barry saw Schaefer's figure outside the window and quickly rushed out. He didn't notice that his wife clearly saw everything from the side. Schaefer had arranged a 2,000-acre airport for Barry, along with detailed task instructions and a map. As Barry was feeling a bit lost with the new task, he suddenly noticed a backpack on the wing. It was the $600,000 commission Jorge had given Barry. Barry immediately realized that since the backpack was here, it meant the CIA was tacitly approving his cooperation with Jorge and others. Excited, he quickly grabbed the bag and rushed towards the house, only to be met by his wife's punches and kicks. Anyone would be angry if they were suddenly woken up in the middle of the night and moved to another place. Moreover, Barry had injuries on his face, and his actions were sneaky. This made his wife think her husband had committed a crime and was going to jail. But Barry explained that he had just changed jobs. Facing his wife's endless complaints, he simply took the money from the bag and tossed stack after stack onto the floor. His wife was instantly stunned by the sight of the full backpack of cash. Then Barry told his wife that he was now working for the CIA. After successfully resolving the family crisis, Barry began his new job, but on his first weapon transport, he ran into danger. The rebels, like bandits, robbed him, even taking his shoes. So the second time, Barry got smarter and prepared 2 boxes of gifts for the rebels. He even took a baseball bat for self-defense, but it still didn't help him avoid being robbed. Luckily, Jorge arrived just in time to rescue him. The man by his side was the CIA's American head in charge of managing the rebels. The 2 men found Barry to discuss a business deal. They wanted him to directly transport guns to Colombia. Then they planned to ship contraband from there to the rebels' camp, with the rebels smuggling them to Miami by fishing boats. It turned out the rebels didn't want to fight. On the contrary, Jorge needed the weapons more than they did. Barry found this utterly absurd, but the conditions Jorge offered were impossible to refuse. Unable to resist the temptation, Barry ultimately decided to proceed with the new plan. Though the new route was more complicated than before, he quickly began making a fortune. He even recruited 4 more people to help him with the work. With 5 planes working together, Barry's earnings were like those of a money-printing machine. But just then, Schaefer came looking for him again. Because Barry had delivered weapons to the drug dealers, the rebels were retreating step by step. The CIA believed it was due to the rebels' poor combat skills, so they wanted Barry to bring them to the US for training. Although this meant Barry could no longer transport contraband, he had no choice but to follow the CIA's orders. Schaefer, seeing the continuous flow of weapons being shipped out and people brought back, grew more and more satisfied with Barry's work. But Barry now had new worries. After some time, his money had accumulated to an unimaginable amount. He had at least tens of millions in each bank, and they even built him a new vault. His small house had turned into a large villa, but even so, he still had so much money that there was nowhere to hide it. Every space in the house was filled with cash, and even the yard was buried with it everywhere. When he tried to bury more money, he found that beneath the ground, there was still cash. Just as Barry was enjoying his perfect life, misfortune quietly arrived. The FBI had detected the unusual flow of large amounts of money, and after an investigation, they directly targeted Barry. As if trouble wasn't enough, Barry was unexpectedly flagged by the Border Patrol on his way back. He flew all the way to the small town where his home was, yet he couldn't shake the pursuit. Helpless, Barry was forced to make an emergency landing, only stopping when he crashed into a house. Barry knew he was now being watched and dared not rush home. So he sought help from Jorge, not knowing that Jorge was in trouble himself. After being targeted by the Drug Enforcement Administration, Jorge declared war on them using the weapons he had. Now, there was only one safe place left, Nicaragua. But Jorge seized the opportunity to make a demand. If Barry wanted to seek refuge in Nicaragua, he would need to help them transport another 1,500 kilograms of contraband. At that moment, Barry's wife suddenly called. It turned out that Barry's brother-in-law, JB, had stolen the cash from his briefcase while Barry was away. He then swaggered through the town, only to run into a police officer who had been watching Barry for a long time. Hearing this, Barry feared his troubles would involve his family, so he decided to go home and deal with JB first. But Jorge offered to help, as long as Barry agreed to transport the goods. Reluctantly, Barry agreed to Jorge's request and rushed to bail JB out of jail. He warned JB to stay as far away as possible and not contact him again. But JB clearly felt that Barry hadn't given him enough, so he angrily yelled at him.
it, Barry. You're gonna start sending me cash on the fucking regular. You understand? Fuck you, man. Fuck you and my cunt sister. Money every week, asshole.
Barry instantly realized this was what Jorge meant by helping solve the problem. But the situation had already happened, and no matter how unwilling he was, he had no choice but to push JB's car down the hill. After briefly handling the car, Barry returned to his airport. However, he noticed a large convoy of military vehicles leaving. Schaefer explained that he was returning the rebels to their original position. The trained individuals had not gone to the front lines, and the supporting firearms had appeared in Colombia. Barry immediately realized that his actions had been exposed, but Schaefer didn't arrest Barry immediately, as he had more important matters to attend to. Back at headquarters, Schaefer immediately ordered everyone to destroy all evidence related to Barry. Barry had been abandoned, and he was well aware of it. He hurriedly ordered his men to move the things from the airport, but they couldn't finish until nightfall.
Seal! DEA! Back away from the truck with your hands in the air. ATF! Drop your weapons! Put your guns down!
Whoa! DEA!
Where are your guns?
State police! What the fuck are y'all doing in my county?
Nobody move!
FBI!
And just like that, Barry was arrested by 4 departments simultaneously and escorted to the state prosecutor's office. The state prosecutor had long been appalled by Barry's numerous crimes and was eager to eliminate this threat once and for all. But a phone call from the governor saved Barry's life, and he was released without charges. Barry thought that Schaefer had saved him to cover up those shady dealings. However, the person who took him away claimed they didn't even know Schaefer. Confused, Barry was taken to a white palace. He could only stand there as politicians and officers argued in front of him. It turned out that the DEA wanted to take down Jorge's drug cartel. The military, on the other hand, wanted to prove that the Soviets were secretly controlling the cartel. The reason they spared Barry was so he could make another deal with the drug cartel. Then they would take the opportunity to gather evidence and fulfill both parties' demands. Since he had a chance to redeem himself, Barry naturally wouldn't let it slip away. So he once again risked his life and went to Nicaragua. Using a hidden camera, he captured clear photos of Jorge, his men, and the rebels. Soon after, the president publicly accused Nicaragua of drug trafficking to the US on a TV program. What Barry didn't expect was that his face was clearly visible in the photos they displayed. He immediately realized he'd been set up, and sure enough, the FBI raided their home shortly after. But what truly worried Barry was the ruthless revenge that Jorge and his men would surely take. JB's death was still deeply etched in Barry's mind, and now he was certain they wouldn't spare him. To protect his wife and children from retaliation, Barry first moved them far away. He then faced the trial alone, perhaps due to his attempt at redemption. Barry was sentenced to only 1,000 hours of community service. The moment Barry walked out of the courtroom, he sighed with relief. But everything was far from over. From then on, he moved from hotel to hotel, never staying in one place for more than a day. Meanwhile, he recorded his every memory on video, hoping that these tapes would make Jorge and his men think twice and protect himself. Every step he took was cautious, and even when starting his car, he made sure to drive away anyone nearby. He feared that another tragedy like JB's would unfold, involving innocent people. Barry needed to complete 120 days of community service to regain his freedom. He went to the veterans shelter every day to volunteer. On the 36th day of his service, Jorge's men found him again. Once soaring high in the sky, Barry had finally fallen victim to this irreversible adventure. And Barry's other associates did not escape legal consequences either. Schaefer, however, was unaffected as he had distanced himself from Barry in time. In fact, he got promoted for proposing a plan to support Iran. Barry's wife moved back to their original home with the children, working at McDonald's to make a living. Throughout the film, Barry's life was like an out-of-control airplane. No matter how high and fast he flew, he could not escape the fate of crashing. Barry once had everything people envied, but in the end, he lost it all. He could never turn back and could never undo the mistakes he had made. Perhaps he never truly understood that on the road of life, the most terrifying thing is not how high you can fly, but how to bear the inevitable fall.